Welcome to the Week 7, Day 2 video lecture. We'll discuss a few novels from the module. In doing so, we will review all the stuff that you see on screen, including helping you understand what is a storyboard and how you can use it for Project 2. But rather than just talk about novels, we're going to discuss just two genres of novels today, starting with utopian novels. The idea of utopia can represent fantastical worlds and unattainable ideals. Though Thomas More birthed the word utopia with his tale of the same title, Plato's Republic can be considered a starting point for utopian thought. Commonalities in utopian novels include the elimination of war, whether the utopian novel can be classified as Marxist, feminist, or both. Novels like A Strange Manuscript found in a copper cylinder and 300 Years Hence do not consider class and gender in their utopian equations. Jonathan Swift managed to satirize the wrongs of class separation and the justice system in his epic Gulliver Travels, but he barely touched on issues of gender. It was Edward Bellamy who brought together the elements of a warless, gender-neutral, and class-neutral utopia, creating a new definition of utopia with his works Looking Backward and Equality. What followed after were many utopian novels of the same vein, but usually located on an island or unknown region of the earth. In 1905, H.G. Wells came to understand that a modern utopia, a phrase he uses often in his novel of the same title, cannot be isolated. A modern and sustainable utopia must encompass the entire world. Not only that, but a sustainable utopia must be ever-changing, ready to adapt, ready to evolve, and never to hit a stasis. According to Wells and Bellamy, state control, or a Marxist society, is necessary for a sustainable utopia. However, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World displays how state control can create a new kind of utopia, one that leads to dystopia. As we're going to review, utopia has been redefined over the centuries. In Charlotte Perkin Gilman's Herland, three young men stumble upon an enlightened city ruled entirely by asexual females. Missoura, a Prophecy is another feminist civilization imagined by Mary Bradley. There are many other utopian works written both new and old, but we'll review one example from the modules. The Book of the City of Ladies is a renowned work of literature by Christine de Pizan in the 15th century. Pizan constructs an elaborate city made up of three allegorical virtues: reason, rectitude, and justice. These personified virtues guide Christine through the city and help her gather and assemble a community of remarkable women, both real and fictional, from various historical periods. The city acts as a metaphorical sanctuary where women can find solace, recognition, and empowerment. Throughout the story, Christine engages in conversations with illustrious women, ranging from biblical figures to queens, warriors, philosophers, poets. She challenges the prevailing belief that women are inherently inferior to men. Utopian works from any author, a man or a woman, should not be discounted, but sometimes they can be understood as potentially lacking in gender consideration, depending on the story. This does not mean that well-known utopian tales are devoid of impact in other ways. One fairy tale utopia from 1905 brought new and old ideas of what constitutes sustainability and how Marxism might play out on a global scale. Modern utopia is half story and half utopian textbook. H.G. Wells entertains the reader in this story by creating two characters who find themselves magically transposed in a utopian setting. This at one point was a common trope in a lot of utopian stories. Just find one or two regular people, put them inexplicably in a utopian world, and see utopia through their eyes. Wells does all of these things in a modern utopia, but he does some uncliche things as well. First, he does not confine his version of utopia, of Marxist utopia, to one isolated country. Rather, he acknowledges in order for utopia to be sustainable, it must encompass the entire world. Wells openly recognizes the need for racial and gender equality in order for a true utopia to exist. In 1905, such things were not just unheard of, they were more radical than the idea of Marxism. Nevertheless, Wells devotes entire chapters to how each part of his utopia will function, another new facet when it came to utopias of the early 1900s. In opposition to Pizan's utopia, Wells' story is an example of a critical utopia. For example, a modern utopia still requires a form of currency, gold coins, to be used by the citizens. And currency is practically unheard of in utopian stories unless it's an equal spread of wealth, like the credits used in Looking Backwards. Dissidents of utopia in this story are sent to islands, and that's similar to the dissidents in Brave New World. Lastly, women in a modern utopia are equal to men, but their only job prospects mentioned is motherhood, and they're not allowed to work outside of the home unless they provide adequate alternative care for their children. I mean, that makes sense. The society in a modern utopia is full of laws that are constantly revised and renewed, the idea of a better generation in mind. Consider how these two utopian tales, the one from Pizan and the one from Wells, inform and differ from one another. Oh, I think I skipped a slide. Oh yeah, I wanted to also add some questions to think about, especially if you pick one of these stories for your journal. Consider, what is utopia? How might these ideals go horribly wrong? How can individuality be sustained in a supposed utopia? How does utopian story settings align with feminist literary criticism? And finally, consider how an absolute anything is the antithesis to utopia, because absolutism or perfection does not always align with reality. Now let's discuss another type of novel in the modules, horror novels. More specifically, let's discuss contemporary diverse horror. Horror fiction appeals to audiences on different levels, creating a variety of subgenres. There are varied definitions of horror narratives, and what really qualifies as horror is continually in flux. In his work, Dean Conrad states of science fiction, it will always be a matter of argument. By that, he means the definition of science fiction is continually in flux. Fans and critics apply attributes to their version of the genre. In the same way, horror will always be an argument in terms of definition. At the heart of Gothic horror is place. There were always hints of horror, twisted magic, and violence in century-old narratives, or maybe what we think of as older horror. Yet with the arrival of the Castle of Otranto, The atmosphere of a haunted castle and the oddities of the characters therein suddenly became important to the newly coined genre brought on by this story and the creator, Horace Walpole. The basic premise of the Gothic includes what David B. Morris relates as a need for the terror of the sublime, exaggerations, and repetitions. The Castle of Otranto is composed of exaggerations and repetitions of suspense. While setting is part of the Gothic definition, Justin Edwards writes of the boundaries of the British Gothic as being defined by its fantastic, metaphysical, externalized, and class-based characteristics. So having money and status has strong associations with older Gothic narratives. In canon horror fictions, many of the owners of these large, drafty buildings are affluent. Though they're not always the protagonists, owners of the staid Gothic settings are usually part of the story in some way. Scholar Jared Hoggle discusses Gothic's appeal to a largely white audience by including characters and themes revolving around middle-class white protagonists. Such definitions of horror not only identify boundaries, but also result in stagnation regarding how the genre can change. Other definitions of the Gothic shift from class toward broader interpretations, like the one from Anne Williams. She states how the Gothic has provided Anglo-American culture with a space of monstrous otherness, even as past Gothic fictions have relied upon Walpole's formula of upper-class tragedies in a spooky setting. They've also allowed for rejection of the monster and for parallels to humanity. Contemporary horror has been merging realism with the supernatural. Examples can include what we see on the screen, and these stories take the format from the Castle of Otranto to spin a fantastical tale under the guise of a true story, updating this format to include average, though not necessarily diverse characters to relay the stories as first-person observers. There are several examples of diverse contemporary horror novels, such as The Changeling and the other titles that we see on the screen. We'll also review 2 contemporary novels from the module. The password that you see on the screen is for the day 2 assignment that requests it. If you include the correct assignment, bolded, italicized, or highlighted, you can earn up to 2 extra credit points. Let's start discussing the first diverse contemporary horror novel from the module, Mexican Gothic. This can be considered a sort of retelling of several Gothic tales, such as Wuthering Heights and The Yellow Wallpaper. The story explores free will and power structures from white and Hispanic cultural perspectives. The Doyle family grow edible spores inside women's bodies to perpetuate a vampiric-like existence. Noemi, the protagonist of Mexican Gothic, is viewed as a monstrous other by the Doyles. She's an assertive Mexican woman with wealth and confidence, which to the Doyle family is foreign and monstrous. To capitalize on this fountain of youth, the Doyle family harvests spores from the bodies of outsiders. The mycelium then attaches to the walls of their home to settle as an odd sort of wallpaper. Noemi finds the wallpaper and wonders at its textures, thinking of how certain dyes in Victorian households were unknowingly releasing toxins. Her musings and her family member Catalina's uncharacteristic behavior are reminiscent of The Yellow Wallpaper, a story that implies men seek to control their wives by claiming they are ill or crazy. Howard Doyle of Mexican Gothic shares that his wife Agnes had died when in reality he sacrificed her body and mind to become a hub to house to house and grow the spores. Redefining horror and horror protagonists is also a large part of the second contemporary diverse novel from the module, Pitch Dark. A name and cultural perception can also define self, as the protagonist Laura Cruz encounters in Pitch Dark. Courtney Alameda's Pitch Dark explores themes of imperialist power, free will, and the monstrous other. Laura struggles with the racial prejudice in the future and with how whiteness is deliberately obtained by the citizens. The author researched her Mexican history and wrote Pitch Dark as a sci-fi horror story of pop culture and social representation. The two main characters, Laura and Tuck, meet across time and space. They team up to defeat monsters roaming aboard Tuck's ship in deep space, while also contending with the body tech forced on Laura by her controlling ex-boyfriend. Agency and oppression are two focal points of the story, inspired by the saying that is on the screen. The saying originated from Zapatista rebels who used it as a rallying cry against a government they considered oppressive and dependent on ideals instilled by Mexico's Spanish colonizers. The character in Pitch Dark, Laura Cruz, was partly born from a virtual space. Alameda confesses that Laura Cruz is modeled after Tomb Raider Laura Croft, who is originally of South American heritage, named Laura Cruz. With the early concept models of Laura Croft, she has a more Hispanic look. Laura's look in Pitch Dark, or I'm sorry, Laura's look in the game, her personality, and even her name changed after a company merger decided on a more UK-friendly version, and thus Laura Croft was needed. Consider what might the body horror in Mexican Gothic or Pitch Dark imply about cultural relations and individuality. Another thought, how does the idea of a retelling apply to either horror story mentioned? What themes may be highlighted when either work is viewed through the critical lens we discussed this week? How might both stories exemplify how horror was, is, and can further redefine itself? Okay, lecture time over, so we can review part of Sunday's homework assignment, asking you to complete a storyboard. Storyboards are common in literature or visual media, and they just help you outline your ideas. P2 is a multimodal project, a presentation rather than an essay, so using a storyboard can help jumpstart your work. You don't need to construct a complex storyboard. Think back to your 3 subtopics for project 2 and start there. To complete Sunday's homework, a 4-panel storyboard is sufficient. Oh, that's only part of Sunday's homework. But you can use the template as seen on the screen, and you can access it via the assignment guidelines. Using 4 of the panels is sufficient. You don't have to use all 8. Or you can add a bit more detail and color. You can use PowerPoint or Canva. The student sample on the screen used Canva. As we can see, there's not a lot of text there, but rather there's a reliance on headers, there's some visuals, and it's moving us visually through their ideas, their 3 main topics. Basically, the storyboard's an informal and visual way to map out your subtopics for project 2. May also help you realize that you want to use PowerPoint, Canva, or a different app for your P2 presentation. As always, reach out with any questions.